Yo guys, what is up? We are here with another reading video. We are on to chapter 9. We are coming so far in this book, and I'm really excited because the farther we go, the more exciting it gets. So, my book suggestion for today is the book Wednesday Wars. It is a book on the 2018-19 middle school Battle of the Books, North Carolina. I read it in 3rd grade. It's a really fun, exciting book, and it's about family and just the way that wars and different views can affect a family in different ways. So, without further ado, once I find the chapter, 12, 11, 10... Ooh, 9's a long chapter. Woohoo! Okay. Chapter 9. The only thing to fear. Sarah hardly slept that night. Once she had snuck back into the house, she waited by her window for hours, jumping at any sound. A creaking floorboard, a dripping sink. Every hair on her neck stood at attention as she stared out the window, peering for a Nazi truck to come and arrest her. Stupid, 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 she told herself. She had tried to be so careful, but then she had to plow into Bastian and his mother on their nightly stargazing tour. A bead of sweat rolled down Zara's forehead. What had she been thinking? She had used her power in the square and ruined the future's portrait. If she had gotten caught, she would have been thrown into prison and left there to wither, or shot on the spot. Even worse, she would have broken her uncle's heart. Zara's eyes fixed on the photograph on her nightstand, scanning Uncle Red's proud face and Miss Tally's smiling one. Her heart felt split in two. Maybe it had been a reckless thing to do, defacing the future's portrait. Maybe it had been rash, dangerous. But did Miss Tally deserve some sort of retribution? Zara clutched the photo against her chest. She couldn't regret what she had done tonight. No, she had had enough of her father's caution and endless waiting. The Nazis had taken far too much from her. She wouldn't let them take anything else. Hours later, Sarah jolted awake to her alarm and realized she must have drifted asleep. Hurrying to the window, she stared at the road, but she didn't see any trucks or police vehicles. Her breath eased a little. There was no way Bastian could have recognized her last night. She had worn her mask and her grandpa's big coat. Besides, Bastian had been too preoccupied with his mother. As Zara gathered her work uniform, she realized she had never seen Frau Eckhart up close. When Bastian's mother first arrived in Greenfield years ago, she had busied herself as the new colonel's wife. She had organized stargazing nights for the town's German children and led the Nazi Women's Charity League. But now Frau Eckhart rarely ventured out into public, aside from the occasional league function. Not since the writing accident that had shattered her backbone and her mind 6 years ago. Dun dun dun! It surprised Zara how much Bastian took after his mother, with the same pale hair and same slim nose, except Frau Eckhart resembled a faded version of her son. Bleached white tresses, bony jawline, and a pretty face marred by circles under her eyes. Perhaps it was a good thing Bastian was an only child. Frau Eckhart may not have been blessed with children, as the Nazis called it, but another pregnancy might have done her in. With her nerves somewhat settled, Zara chewed on a chunk of bread for breakfast and slipped out the door while her uncle was showering. She jogged towards the school, not wanting a demerit for tardiness. But her feet slowed when she neared the courthouse. Gathered out front, a small group of people stood on the front steps of the building, murmuring to one another and shaking their heads. The portrait, Zara thought, and automatically drew a few yards closer. Her neck craned to get a better view. The painting was gone. Zara blinked at the stretch of bright red bricks where the portrait had hung just the night before. The Nazis must have removed it early this morning. The crowd kept whispering. A few of them pointed at the roof, and one of the women gasped. Zara, of course, looked up. She squinted at the lip of the rooftop, and air promptly fled from her lungs. There, on the roof, The Nazi had propped up a metal cage, the size of a coffin, and inside of it there was a skeleton of blackened bones, held up by a pair of butcher's meat hooks. Miss Tally. Zara went lightheaded, and she had to blink the dizziness away before she lost her balance. The Nazis had never done anything like this before. It was too cruel, too wrong. Slowly, Zara's gaze found its way back to the roof and the cage entered her sight once more. She flinched and shut her eyes, but the image had been imprinted in her memory. She staggered down the sidewalk, knowing she had to keep moving or she'd collapse. Tears huddled in her eyes as she arrived at the academy and found her way to the utility room. She sank onto the floor with her head between her knees, taking deep breaths to calm herself. The other 4 cleaning girls edged towards the door as if Zara were a wounded animal. Only Christy stepped forward. Shift starts in 5 minutes, she said coolly. Don't you think I know that? Zara lashed out. She sprang to her feet, wanting Christy to lash back at her, to call her that word. She was itching for a fight. Christy rolled her eyes and resumed tying her smock. Go home if you're going to be sick. No one's going to clean up after you. I didn't ask you to, said Zara, but Christy was out the door already, and the rest of the girls following her. Zara sank back against the cold metal lockers. It was bad enough that she had to watch Miss Tally die. Now the Nazis had strung her up like a horrifying scarecrow. She knew the colonel was sending a message to whoever had defiled the fierce portrait. You want to play games with us, he seemed to be saying. We shall play your little game. The bell rang to start the school day, and Zara somehow managed to work straight through lunch until she overheard a table of cadets talking about the caged skeleton in the square. After she rinsed off every pot and dirty plate, she had a 20-minute break for her own lunch. But instead of nibbling on some of the leftovers, she fled over the woods beyond the academy's perimeter. She wove through the trees until she heard nothing but the puff of her breath and the breeze whispering through the soft spring leaves. Only then did Zara stop beneath a fat oak tree and brace her hands against its cracked bark. A sharp anger twisted inside her chest, stabbing its harsh blade against her heart. Around Zara the wind swelled. It swirled by her shoes, kicking up moss and dead leaves. Her power may have been weakened after the blow to her head, but now it was bursting inside, begging to be unleashed. So Zara released it. Overhead, the branches swayed and the leaves shivered, clinging to their stems against the human-made storm. She stretched out her arm. Stick straight. Spin, she demanded. The funnel spun into existence, only 4 inches high. Spin! The funnel doubled its height. Then it grew 6 inches more. Higher! A twig snapped behind Zara. The little tornado spun away into nothing. Whipping around, Zara saw someone walking 30 yards behind her. Her anchor wilted, replaced by panic. She thrust her hands behind her. Had he seen the tornado? No, he was too far away for that. Zara's panic failed to ebb. Maybe he had recognized her last night at the courthouse, but he wouldn't have any proof of it, would he? It would be his word against hers. Zara nibbled her lip, yet his word would carry much more clout than hers. Hello, Fraulein, Bastian said, his hands buried in his pockets. He crossed the distance between them. I was getting a drink of water when I saw you leave. Are you all right? She eyed him. I'm fine, Herr Eckhart. I was getting some fresh air, but I was about to head back to work. She didn't seem to hear her. There is something I must discuss with you. About the housekeeping job? Her throat tightened as she thought about bumping into him and her mother last night. Please let it be about the job. No, he drew in a deep breath. We don't need a new housekeeper. I fibbed about that because I didn't know how else to speak to you privately. The words fell out of his mouth, dripping over one another. Speak to me about what? She said slowly. I heard that your grandfather had ties to the Alliance, he forced out. I was wondering if maybe your uncle was involved with them too. Zara's stomach dropped against her feet. She had lost Miss Tally, and now her uncle's life might be in danger. She had to handle this conversation very carefully, even though she wanted to flee home this instant. My uncle is loyal to the Fuhrer. I promise you that, she said, struggling to contend and trembling in her voice. You misunderstand. If it is true about your uncle's involvement, heal Hitler! Zara's heart pedaled faster. If Bastian had any proof about her uncle's ties to the Alliance, that she didn't want to think about what would happen next. An arrest? A beating? Another execution? She told herself to breathe. She couldn't let him get any more suspicious of her or her family. I don't wish to get you or your uncle in trouble, Bastian's voice lowered to a whisper. I want to join you. Zara could only blink at him. She must have heard him wrong. I want to join the alliance. In fact, I must join the alliance. Finally, Zara realized what he had been up to these last few days. The housekeeping job, calling her Fraulein instead of girl. He was baiting her for a confession. Colonel Eckhart must have put him up to this, hoping Bastian's handsome face would loosen her lips about Uncle Red. There was no way she would fall for their little scheme. My apologies, but my uncle's an upstanding citizen. We can't help you. Zara willed her voice to be steady. We've always met our quota. We don't want any trouble. Please, I know how this must look, especially with my father being who he is, but I have to contact the Alliance. I've trained as a medic, both at the academy and with my grandfather. I could be an asset to them. He rattled off his reasoning like he had rehearsed it for hours. Zara had heard enough. I have to get back to my shift. Excuse me. She made only a few steps before Bastian caught up to her. My Opa. I'm doing this for him. His hand clenched around the dog tags. I'm sorry about your grandfather's passing, but the Nazis killed him. He bit his lip. He bit his bottom lip to collect himself before he could speak again. For committing treason. Treason? That made Zara pause. She looked up at Bastian as he towered over her with his 6-foot height. He was breathing hard, his nostrils flared, and there was anguish in those amber eyes of his. Had his father fed him these lies and coached him for this moment? The colonel was sorely mistaken to think she would fall for this. Zara must have seen the doubt in her eyes. There is a word that I'm pretty sure is not a good word. Apparently he swore in German, so I'm not going to say the word. But yeah. Okay. So, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Wait, hold up. He swore in German. This is coming out all wrong. You have to believe me. I'm not my father. I'm not a Nazi, and I never will be. I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Zara knew she had to deny all knowledge of the Alliance until he gave up on her. My uncle has never been involved with the resistance. Give me a few minutes to explain. He continued on before she could answer him. Opa was a communist. He was involved with the underground party in Nazi-controlled Belgium for many years before he moved to the territories to help with my mother. But a year ago, he and my father had a falling out over my mother's care. Father cut short Opa's travel visa, and that forced my grandfather to return to Brussels. That's when he joined the Widerstand. The Widerstand? Zara coughed out. The Widerstand was the Nazi opposition group that sprang up during the war and has survived to this day. It now spanned across Europe, much like the Alliance, but on a greater scale. In the last year alone, its members had bombed 3 forts near Berlin and kidnapped 5 Nazi officers. Zara wondered who would come up with this explanation. Communists in the Widerstand? Colonel Eckhart should have known that she would see straight through it. As much as she despised him, she had to admit he wasn't stupid. But if this colonel wanted this plan to work, to lull Zara into trusting Bastian, then he would have to concocted a better story. Bastian kept talking. I know this all sounds ridiculous. I wouldn't have believed it myself if it hadn't happened to my family. His fingers raked through his curls, but it did happen. My Opa was arrested during a raid and he was hanged for it. His eyes clapped shut. My father could have stopped it, but he didn't. He was a very good actor. Zara would give him that. His voice had turned to poison when he mentioned his father. If she were more naive, she would have asked him what he meant by that. But she wasn't a simple farm girl. Her uncle had taught her better. I have to go, Zara said. She had stayed far too long already. The other cleaning girls would have reported her to the academy administration by now. Wait! There was a pleading look on his face. He held up the dog tags for Zara to read. Albert Dubois. That's my Opa's name. You can check for yourself on the school computers. There's no need. She pulled away from him. But Bastian caught her elbow. His breath hitched. startled that he had touched her. He was everything to me. Bastian's voice, usually so polite and clipped, took on a desperate edge. He raised me. I owe this to him. Zara hesitated. She could have spoken the very same words. She felt the very same way about Miss Tally, but she couldn't trust Bastian, not after what his father had done to the one she loved. I'm sorry, she repeated. Then she fled back to the academy. Zara spent the rest of the workday dusting windowsills and scrubbing the gymnasium floors. But her thoughts never strayed far from Bastian. He hadn't returned to school after their talk in the woods, but that hadn't stopped him from occupying every corner of her mind. The story he had told verged on the ridiculous. His grandfather, a communist, a rebel with a lighter stand? Surely Colonel Eckhart would have come up with something more plausible than that. So why hadn't he? He must be planning something. Unless Bastian was telling her the truth? But that couldn't be possible either. Zara knew that she could never trust an Eckhart, but a small part of her, a tiny speck, wanted to sneak into the computer lab and look up Albert Du Bois, just to make sure. Yet she couldn't waste another minute on Bastian, a boy like him, Aryan-born and Nazi-raised. He had been spoon-fed German doctrine since birth. Bastian was simply a pawn on his father's chessboard, and Zara needed to avoid him and his pretty face at all costs. With her mind jumbled of questions, Zara headed home right after she washed the chalkboards, hoping a few hours on the farm would clear the mess in her head. She rounded the last bend to her house, eager to change out of her loafers and into her trusty boots. But she stopped stone still at the sight of the Nazi SUV pulling out of her driveway. Thoughts of Bastian and the Alliance fled from her mind. The Nazis had no reason to come to her home, unless they had found the knife she used to destroy the fierce portrait. But she had buried the blade in the fields last night, plunging it deep within the spring-warm soil. Still, her heartbeat refused to slow. A visit from the Nazis was never a good thing. The SUV turned onto the road and slowed to a stop once it neared Zara. The passenger side window rolled down. To reveal Colonel Eckhart sitting inside. Zara almost stumbled back. First Bastian, now his father. Heil Hitler, he said pleasantly, like he had dropped by for a cup of tea. Heil Hitler, Zara murmured with as much gusto as she could stomach. Her eyes darted toward the back seat, and she breathed a sigh of relief. Thankfully, she didn't see her uncle sitting there, his hands in cuffs. I stopped by to speak to your uncle, Colonel Eckhart continued, his gaze drifting over her old blouse and fraying skirt. He sniffed. We had a nice chat. Zara dared to glance into those cruel blue eyes of his. This was the first time she had seen him since Miss Tally's execution. Hatred broke inside of her, spilling into her veins. She wanted to press her fingers against his neck, squeezing until he begged her to stop. Instead, she bowed her head to hide the scowl on her face. I hope you had a pleasant visit, her, Zara managed to say. She tried to muster a smile, but simply couldn't. Is it early for you to be home from work? I walk quickly, her, he corrected harshly. My apologies, her. The colonel turned to his driver, who happened to be Sentinel Akin. Zara couldn't seem to stop bumping into him or the Eckharts. These Klimbra. How often they forget their manners. Sentinel Akin nodded. They should be punished accordingly, her. Then he winked at Zara when the colonel looked down to check his watch. She pressed the urge to run home and leap into the showers. Come closer, girl. Colonel Eckhart crooked a finger at her, and Zara had no choice but to comply. She shuffled towards the window, her squint crawling under his watchful eyes, till his face was only a foot away from hers. I understand you were close to that Alliance spy, Neil Tally. She was a casual acquaintance. Zara winced inside. She hated herself for what she had to say next. She hoped Miss Tally would understand. My uncle and I were appalled by her actions. In the future, I take more precaution with whom you associate, or there will be consequences. Yes, her. She smiled again, with such a bright, He smiled again, such a bright smile, with white, even teeth, but his eyes were steely. Tell your uncle that I'll be in touch, and remember, the harvest is a long way off. Be, be sure to fulfill your quota. I do enjoy fresh cabbage. The window rolled up, and the truck continued down the road, burping a cloud of smoke into Zara's eyes before it gunned down for a gun toward Fort Goring. She watched it leave with clenched fists, wishing she could hurl worm-wadded cabbage at the colonel's head. Once the SUV was out of sight, she ran back to the farmhouse and thrust open the front door. A gasp flew out of her mouth. In the living room, chairs lay broken in jagged pieces, and dozens of old magazines were tumbled over the floor, their pages mashed against the rug. Damage had spread into the kitchen, too. The cupboards hung open like gaping teeth, while shattered plates splattered over the countertops. At the center of the mess, Uncle Red stood with a broom in his hands, his shoulders slumped at a tired angle. He glanced at the door. You're home? The colonel did all of this? Zara's chest hurt as she surveyed the house. Ruined china passed down from her great-grandmother. Novels that her mother had cherished. The Nazis had never done this before. Sure, they had conducted interrogations and broken a piece of furniture or two, but they had never ransacked a house. Not like this. Uncle Red's fist nodded around the broom handle. They've been on a rampage today, interrogating everyone about the fierce portrait. Obviously, they found nothing here, but his eyes hardened. I'm only going to ask you this once. Did you have anything to do with that painting? Of course not. Zara held his gaze, careful not to flinch or look away. Shame nodded in her stomach at that lie, but she couldn't tell him the truth. Her voice quieted. Did you see what they did to Miss Tally's body? He rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking a decade older than he did a second before. I heard about it this morning. We can't leave her up there. We have no choice. Not now, anyway. Eckhart's breathing down her neck more than ever. His hand swept over the kitchen. You see what he's done to our house. But Miss Tally was like family. She was our family. We owe her a proper burial. Uncle Red's forehead creased with into a dozen wrinkles. Don't you think I want that too? Do you think I like what the Nazis did to her? No. Nell would understand that I'm trying to protect you. So we'll leave her up in that cage? Her uncle hadn't been to the square. He hadn't witnessed how cruel this act was. That's enough. He thrust the broom into her hands. Get to work. I'll start upstairs in the bedrooms. Uncle Red exited the kitchen, leaving Zara alone with the clutter at her feet. She watched him disappear up the staircase, wishing so desperately to have her old uncle back. The one before Mission Metzger, the one who would stop at nothing to fight the Nazis, who would never allow a friend's body to hang in a cage. Sarah knew that he loved Miss Sally. There was no doubt about their mutual respect for each other. But the Nazis had beaten every drop of resolve out of him, and he had let them do it. She wouldn't let the same thing happen to herself. Shaking her head, Zara stopped down to collect the larger bits of porcelain. It would take them weeks to save up for new plates. Until then, they would have to use paper ones. With a burdened sigh, she reached for a sliver of glass underneath the kitchen table, but she yanked her hand back when it sliced her fingers. Blood streamed from the wound and onto the floor, bright red against the ivory tiles. Zara muttered a curse and pressed a dish towel against the cut, waiting for the blood to clot before she surveyed the damage. A strange, needle-like stinging spread over the fresh wound, just like it had days before. So, she lifted the cloth to find a flash of blue, a spark, like the tiniest of searchlights. Zara's eyes grew as big as copper coins. She ran to the kitchen window to take a better look at it, but she saw only blood and jagged flesh on her hand. She ran a timid finger against the cut. Nothing. I need more sleep, she thought, her pulse thumping wildly. She must have been seeing things, although that didn't explain the stinging in both of her cuts. Maybe she did need to see a doctor, but they could never afford a trip to the hospital. Miss Tally was the one who treated their bumps and bruises, but she was gone now. 3 knocks thudded against the front door, and Zara jumped at the sound, startled. Wrapping the towel back against her hand, she hurried to the door with the memory of that spark still glued to her thoughts. Zara swung the door open to find a young man with a hazel Nutskin standing on the porch. A dusty hat sat atop his head, and the brown trench coat, a few sizes too big, hung over his lean frame. Behind him, a blue truck sat in the driveway, its paint peeling over most of its rusted body. "Can I help you?" she said, holding the towel tight around her finger. The man appeared a few years older than her, perhaps in his early 20s. Zara wondered if he was a miner looking for extra work or a migrant laborer searching for a place to sleep the night, although he didn't have that dead weary look in his eyes that laborers often wore. The young man tipped his hat. "I'm looking for Redmond St. James, if you please." Uncle Red appeared behind Zara and nudged her aside. "Hello," he said warily. "Good evening. I'm traveling through the town looking for work. I heard that Mr. St. James might be hiring." "I'm afraid you've been mistaken. Best of luck to you." Uncle Red went to close the door, but the man kept talking. "That's too bad. See, I've been traveling all the way from St. Louis." St. Louis? She sought a glance at her uncle. The city had been bombed to pieces by the Nazis years ago after a citizen had rioted for better pay in the car factories. This man had to be lying, but for some reason, Uncle Red opened the door farther. "St. Louis? You're from St. Louis?" "Yes, sir. I'm from Lafayette Park. Might have heard of it?" "I have." Uncle Red chose his words carefully as if he was reading lines from a play. "Wasn't it named for Marquis de Lafayette?" Zara blinked at him. Why would her uncle ask this worker about an obscure historical figure like the Marquis? She'd read about Lafayette a few years ago in one of Miss Talley's contraband books, before her uncle had convinced her to get rid of them. But the Marquis had been a general in the American Revolutionary War. Hardly anyone knew about him now, much less talked about him. Indeed, it was named for him. Like I was saying, do you know where I can find him? Where I can find Redmond St. James? I'm Redmond St. James. And you are Garrison Strayer. It's nice to meet you finally. Redmond, the Alliance sends its greetings. And that was chapter 9. So that was definitely a longer chapter. But the next chapter is chapter 10. Let me take a look at it. Does it look exciting? I think I know what chapter 10 is. Pretty sure. Yes. Okay. So this is a more planning one, but it's going to lead up to some. So this is basically the gateway to the exciting things. Like, what? I think chapter 10 and maybe 11, and then it's purely exciting. So I'm really looking forward to that. So thank you for watching. Thank you for watching. Comment, subscribe, and like, comment, and oh my god, I can't say it now. Comment, subscribe, and like. Subscribe, like, and comment down below, and I will see you in the next video.